Welcome to the Encore Audio Archives YouTube channel. I'm Taper Dave, and this is my channel. I've uploaded hundreds of talks here that I've recorded at meetings in West LA, and I've also recorded conventions starting in 2013. I've got a bunch of those up. And Walt and Mary Murray, the original owners of Encore Audio Archives, started the company in the 80s, and Walt recorded Joe and Charlie's and a bunch of stuff down in Vista, California. My sobriety date is June 20th of 1994. I hope you find something you like, so please like and subscribe to my channel and comment down below. If you want to hear something that I don't have or that you don't see, I'll see that I get it. Anyways, take care and have a great day if you want to.
Now, let us give a warm welcome to our main speaker, Linda A.
Hi, my name's Linda. I'm an alcoholic. First things first. Never eat Mexican food before you speak. All I want to do is lay down and go to sleep. First things first, I want to thank Aaron for asking me to come participate. Thank you, Aaron. I want to thank my posse for coming with me, Cameron and Peggy. I love you madly both. These are my sobriety sisters, and whenever I have to go do something arduous and a little bit fearful, I drag them along with me. Anybody here from the summit? Anybody summit? Ah, Julia says hello. High five from the Jewels. And I'd like to wish everybody happy birthday, all the birthday people, and welcome to the newcomers. And thank you, the first speaker. Totally related. You know, I come from Salem, Massachusetts. Go Patriots. Red Sox, yes, good year. And, I was born and raised, okay, here we go. I'm 18 years sober and some change. And I never, ever, ever planned on staying in Alcoholics Anonymous this long, let me tell you. You hear those people that speak from the podium about, I came for a little rest and, get back out there and drink like a lady. And I got the rest and then I stayed. And it's 18 years later, and it has not been... there was no pink Cadillac that drove me around AA. My arduous journey here was a nightmare, and there's a lot of people in AA who can attest to that. I was not an easy subject, but I'm here, and I'll tell you more about that later. Okay, born in Salem, Massachusetts, raised in Massachusetts. My mother is. Upper sort of middle class, cheerleader, most popular girl in town, supposed to marry wealthy. Her boyfriend was like from the richest family in Marblehead. And then one day at about 17 years old, she went to a dance, a USO dance, and she met my father, who was stationed there during the war. And my father is Mexican. My father's 6'2" and fucking gorgeous. And my mother had never seen anything like him, ever. And it was lust at first sight. And that was the basis for the next, God knows, number of years. And it was not an easy journey for her. She married an alcoholic, and she spent the rest of her life chasing that alcoholic. And what happened is my brother and I got left behind on her journey. We were thrown from home to home. My story is basically growing up in boarding schools, French-speaking boarding schools, and not really knowing what it was like to, have a home and security of a parent who worked a 9 to 5 and came home, and a mother who cooked dinner. That was not to be my story. Well, I had the kind of family that, I have a brother, and I don't think my brother is an alcoholic. My brother has the ism. He has manifested in food and geographics. And, it was not an easy childhood. And to give you a little bit of what it was like, I would be in this boarding school for a year or two at a time, and then my father would come and drag us out of school and, take us across country And a week later, I would be, you know, sitting in the middle of East LA in the projects with my father's family. And here's a girl who grew up speaking French, going to French-speaking boarding schools, and wore these little outfits, these little villager outfits, pleated skirts, sweater sets, little pearls, socks, and, you know, socks to match, these little, you know, Mary Jane shoes. And a week later, I would be in the middle of East LA, you know, with all the Chicanas and the Chicanos going to, like, Roosevelt Junior High School, you know. And the truth is that I felt more comfortable in East LA than I'd ever felt in that boarding school. And, you know, that was to be my story growing up. And then finally my father got it together and he moved us out here, and we lived out here, and I went to school. You know, the last years of junior high into high school I spent in Huntington Park, and I was always in trouble. Always in trouble. I had so much anger and aggression that I was always in a fight, or, you know, intimidating someone to stand back. And I had a posse. I had a little gang of girls, and, you know, if they didn't do what I said, they were like out of the gang. And I had gotten kicked out of school so many times that I ended up in a place called Ramona Junior High School, which is in East LA, and it's a school for incorrigible girls. And the kind of girls that go to that school are gang members. And by the time I got to that school, when I first went there, it was like, oh my God, what have I done now? And then like a week later, I was like doing everybody's homework, and they were getting straight A's, and they were teaching me how to fight and how to dress, and this was the beginning of a dual life that I was to live throughout my using. And here's what it would be. My mother would put me on the bus in the morning, and I'd have one of those little villager outfits on. And I would get on the bus, and my hair would be, you know, like little ponytail, and, you know, the whole little outfit. I'd get off the bus, and, you know, my little Chicano girlfriends would pick me up, and they'd put me in this little straight skirt. Needless to say, I weighed 80 pounds. They used to call me Olive Oil. And this skirt was the size of a toothpick. And they put me in this skirt and a real tight sweater. They'd tease that hair up, and they'd put this makeup on me, and they'd throw me in that lowrider, and we'd go cruise Whittier Boulevard, and, you know, then go to school. You know, and this is really an important part of my story, because these girls taught me how to survive. They taught me how to fight. They taught me how to watch your back and my back. And they basically taught me the rules of the street, which pretty much I think I had already inherently had. But, you know, fast forward to, you know, that was 2 years of my life, then on to, like, school, and then leaving school, and at 17 or 18 is really where my using began. And I remember going to a party, and I met this guy in the kitchen, and it was like lust at first sight. That was it. This guy was gorgeous, and he, you know, we were like checking each other out as we do. And at one point in the evening, he said, you know, we're all going to go out for a smoke. Do you want to go? And I thought, well, I really don't smoke cigarettes, but, you know, I'll take a walk with you. And so we walked around, outside, and they had this funny little cigarette, and I thought, what's this? And he said, well, do you want a hit? And I went, well, you know, you guys go ahead, and like any good alcoholic, you know, we got to watch everyone else do it, and then, you know, we follow suit. So that was my first introduction to drugs, and I'm, you know, although I do have alcoholism, drugs are my choice. I am basically an an IV user, and I like downers. You know, if I can get down, I am happy. If I can get a good nod going, life is great. And what can I tell you? And so I took a hit of that joint, and, you know, me and this guy hooked up, and I remember going home that night, and, you know, in the apartment where we lived, my mother had this, like, shiny green wallpaper, and it had little tufts of, like, fur on it, like, it was like, you know, like they did in the 70s. And I remember sitting on the toilet and, like, locking the door and staring at that thing for hours. And then I got, like, really hungry, and then I got paranoid, and I went, no, this is not happening. And that next weekend, this guy called me up, and I ended up going out with him, and it was that night that everything really clicked for me. He he introduced me to his friends, and this girl named Joan came up to me, and she said, do you want to split this with me? And it was a little red pill called a Seconal. And she said, this is how we do it so you can get off faster. So she emptied it in 2 pieces of tissue, and she said, drink it with some hot chocolate. Nirvana. That was all I can tell you. You know, it was great, and then I blacked out, and then the next day everybody said I was the life of the party, and that's where it all began. And really from, it just was a matter of time. My using escalated really fast, and it escalated to the point within a year that there had been, I blacked out at parties. I remember, flooding this guy's house because I was so loaded. I blacked out in the bathroom, and I left the faucet running, and the door was locked, and they couldn't get in, and the whole bathroom flooded, then the house flooded. I mean, those are the kind of things that would happen to me. And then the first of really, the first really big announcement that I had a problem was my boyfriend's friend had just graduated high school, and he had gotten a Porsche for his birthday, for his graduation. And we all went to a party one night in that car, and we were so loaded that he passed out at the wheel, and the car hit the embankment, flipped over onto the other side of the freeway, and in Porsches, the windows pop out. So the couple in the back seat flew out onto the oncoming traffic. I, for some reason, didn't have my safety belt on, and I flew out into the traffic going the same way, and got pronounced dead at the scene, and they put me in a body bag, and just as they were zipping up the bag, the paramedics said, let's just give it one more try, and the guy found a very, very faint heartbeat, and they ended up taking me out of the body bag, and might as well have just left me there, because it was like I could have carried that body bag until the day I got sober. I really probably became a part of my life, but so that was just kind of the beginning of many, many events to happen in that arena. What really happened for me is I hooked up with this chick, and this girl who was working for Eileen Ford, and she said, do you want to model? And I went, why not? It sounded like fun. And so my girlfriend and I got a contract doing runway modeling in New York for Eileen Ford, and I ended up, going there. And that was to begin really where my life began with drugs and alcohol, because from then on it was all about sex, drugs, rock and roll, and that's really the biggest part of my story is basically that. And what happened for me is I ended up in that arena, and I worked a lot, and I met a lot of famous people, but I had moved back home to Boston, and I found this girl at the time who needed a roommate, and she owned a brownstone in the south of Boston, and she was I don't know if she ever got sober, so she was heir to a very, very, very huge famous fortune, and she was the biggest drug dealer in South Boston, and I moved in, and her house was the first really sort of, place where everybody came to get loaded. And I like to say it was the first shooting gallery probably I had ever seen. And so what would happen was bands would come to town, and they'd come to her house, and we'd sit around in her kitchen. She had this huge round table, and we'd just get loaded all night long. And, and I was just like out there. And I would like work all week and do a lot of runway work. And I would take a train home on the weekend, get loaded, try and clean myself up by Monday morning, take a train back to New York, and it was just like after about a year of this, it was just wearing really thin. I mean, basically 80 pounds thin with track marks. And I couldn't, I would get on the train, I would try to pancake make up my arms and, try and wear like big thick clothes in the middle of summer, like, thermals, and, go to work, so I didn't look so thin. And finally, my agent let me go, and I couldn't work, and I ended up just like hanging out in that house on a 24/7 basis. And it was at this time I met a big-time producer, and he produced a lot of rock shows in Boston, and that's kind of where it all began for me. And I loved it. I loved the lifestyle. I loved what it offered me, and it was great. And I ended up, in the hospital basically at this point in my life with gas gangrene using dirty needles, and they almost cut my arm off. And when I was in the hospital, they didn't know if they were going to be able to save the arm. They were flushing saline in and out of it, and I remember, calling my friends and saying, "Come on, we got to come over. We got to get loaded. I can't stand this. They won't give me any more morphine." And I ended up burning holes in the sheets, and I got out of there, and I said, "Okay, I'm going to stop doing this, and life is going to be great." And I got home, and I was off and running again, and I ended up burning so many bridges there that I ended up, coming back to LA. And I got back to LA, and I kind of had to clean my act up because I really didn't know anybody that, I didn't know where to score. I didn't kind of know the lay of the land. And so I'd met this guy, and I was living with him, and he, one night, told me to get dressed up. He was going to, take me out. And that night, before we went out, I got a call, and it was, from my agent, and she said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "Yeah, why? What do you mean?" She goes, "Are you sober?" And I went, "Yeah." And she goes, "Have you put any weight on?" And I said, "I put a little weight on." And she goes, "Can you do this job that's coming up?" And I went, "Well, what is it?" And Beverly Hills was opening up a new store, and all 10 of the biggest designers were coming to town, and 3 of those designers wanted me to, wear some of their clothes. And I said, "Yes, I can do that." And so I ended up showing up at this store, and I worked for 3 or 4 days, and then, on the 3rd day they had a huge show, and they invited all, everybody in Hollywood, and agents and actors and all this. And at the end of the show, this guy came up to me, and he said, "I've been watching you all night, and I just wanted to let you know that I want to invite you and a few of the girls to this club that I'm opening up tomorrow night. It's going to be very fancy and extremely private, and it's very gourmet, and we want you to come." And I went, "Great." And so, that night the next night we worked, and we got all dressed up, and we went out that night, and I loved this place. And that night, that guy offered me a job, and I quit my job modeling and never went back. And I like to say that the next 12 years in that place was the beginning of an addict's dream. I mean, my addiction found a home. I could use the way I wanted to use. I could work and make a ton of money, and I could meet like anybody there was to meet. And that place was called the Rainbow Bar and Grill. And at that time, when the Rainbow first opened, it was extremely exclusive. You couldn't get in there unless you were somebody. And for the next 10 years, I traveled all over the world. I lived with the drummer from Led Zeppelin, traveled with him for 7 years, lived in Macon with one of the Allman Brothers, dated Keith Richards, yada, 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 blah, blah, blah. And, it was all the same. I picked men who used worse than I used so I could look like, the good girl. And I think that one of the things that kept me in the relationship, the 7-year relationship was so long, was that I had my own bodyguard, because I could create more wreckage than those guys could see in 10 days. I mean, it was insane. And when you have that kind of free reign, I mean, there isn't anything you won't do, because everything's cleaned up after you. And for those next years, I lived the high life. I always had my job at the Rainbow. I paid my own rent. But I lived la vida loca. I mean, I had money, I had cars, I had clothes, I traveled in private jets. It was great. It was great until it wasn't great anymore. And until all my friends started ODing. That man died of an overdose. He choked in his own vomit. There was a musician who I loved dearly. He was an incredibly artistic musician. His name was Tommy Bolin, and he was like my brother, and he used to live with me. And he died in Florida in an apartment of an overdose by himself, and another friend of mine OD'd, set himself on fire on a nod. I mean, it just goes on and on. And what happened for me is I kind of became a victim of my own excess, and I started getting, a little bit more dangerous with my life. And like our first speaker, I found freebase, and that was to be the thing that brought me to my knees eventually. And my using in that area was just, I ended up doing all the things I swore I would never do. I had a boyfriend of 10 years who was a huge drug smuggler. He worked for 3 of the biggest smugglers in the country, and And on any given weekend, our big excursion out would be to fly up to San Francisco, meet a stranger in a bar, exchange, like you see in the movies, exchange a suitcase at a bar stool, go to an empty hotel room somewhere in the Haight district and blow dry money that had been dug up from Big Sur, millions of dollars, then rent a car and take 2 weeks to drive down the coast because we'd get so loaded we have to stop every 2 hours at a motel. And it was kind of like, it was, and I thought, wow, this is such a great life. But what happened for me is, things just stopped working. Fast forward to, I ended up wrecking cars, passing out, almost killing myself during that freebase run. And I ended up, for some reason, one day, I passed out in the shower and hit my head and got a concussion. And I went to bed that night and I said, no more. I can't do this anymore. And I never smoked freebase after that day, but I did continue my cocaine use. I had stopped using heroin by then. By the way, I was a big junkie. And I like heroin and cocaine. Those were my favorite things, but alcohol was always in there. My father was an alcoholic, so I swore I would never drink. But, later on in life, when I hit my late 20s and 30s, alcohol always got me to that drug faster because, there'd be days where I'd say I'm not doing drugs anymore, but, I'd go out for that drink and that drink would lead me to a drug. And I don't know, all I know is this is how it stopped working for me is I would wake up in the middle of the night and I would bolt up out of bed and in a dark room and I would not know where I was and I wouldn't know who I was. I couldn't remember my name. I couldn't remember what street I lived on. I couldn't remember anything about my life. And I was in a cold sweat, shaking. And what I know today now is what we call I was spiritually dead. There was nothing left in me. And what happened for me is a friend of mine came to town. He was playing at the Universal Amphitheater for a week. It was his birthday. He was given a party at Tiffany's. He had shut down Tiffany's, and there was like just silver bowls full of drugs. And my date had, I got so loaded, and my date put his jacket down, and I rifled his jacket, and he had a couple of grams of coke. I stole his car keys. I jumped in his car, and I don't even remember that part of it, except for after I woke up in the middle of nowhere. And I was in a blackout, and I woke up somewhere in Inglewood, I can't remember where, knocking on someone's door saying, let me in. I know you have drugs in there. I need a Valium. I need anything. And I woke up to this man saying, lady, if you do not get away from my door, I'm going to shoot this gun, and then I'm going to call the police because you are trespassing. Now, that was my first minuscule kind of spiritual awakening, And I got back in the car, drove back to the party, went up to him and said, here, I just stole your drugs and your car keys. I'm giving them back to you. I'm going to take a cab home. And I got home that night, and I got on my knees, and I said, dear God, I can't do this anymore. And I don't know what happened. It was somewhere within a year of that time. I mean, there's so many more events. I could sit here and give you countless war stories, and none of them no greater than the other and none no less than the other, but basically you get a gist of what it was like for me. Somewhere within the next year, I ended up in an AA meeting, and how I ended up in an AA meeting was not through my own volition. My girlfriend, her boyfriend that she had been living with for a couple of years, dumped her for a sober girl, and she was pissed off. So she would get us all together at the house, and we would get so loaded we couldn't even walk. We get all dressed up, and we jump in her car, and we go to meetings and look for him. Sounds good to me. And our first meeting, Cameron, are you awake? And our first meeting was Monday night Kelton candlelight. And there was about 6 of us, and we were out of our gourds. And there was some speaker speaking, and he was talking about God and this, like, awakening and how he was, living the spiritual life, and how he, like, was giving it away and sponsoring and goes on these retreats. And, I would chime in and go, yeah, but who you fucking to get there, you know, and everybody would turn around and go, shh, and we'd look at him and go, fuck you. And then, you know, he'd speak again, and then somebody else would chime up and go, hey, here's my number. Come over if you want good head, you know. And it's like, this was at, like, Monday Night you know, I think back now. And I remember going to that meeting, like, completely sober and was, like, mortified, you know, because it was just like, oh, there's a child in the room. Oh, my God. I'm so sorry. Excuse me. I'm sorry. And, you know, this is how I was introduced to AA, because unbeknownst to me, you know, I mean, I had seen movies like The Lost Weekend and, you know, all these kind of things, and it didn't even dawn on me that there was such a place. I never even knew, and I didn't know that you could go to a hospital and get well. But we ended up just going to these meetings, and for some reason, I just started going on my own. But, you know, what I forget to tell you is that years before that, my hairdresser had started 12-stepping me. And, you know, and it was just like, what are you talking about? You know, we all thought that he was losing his mind. Anyway, I ended up going to meetings by myself, and I would hear speakers, and, you know, I kind of ended up getting this sponsor, and you know, at this time, I'd ended up left the Rainbow, and I had went to work at this place called Bustangos, and they had this program. I had become a wine taster, and they had this program that they schooled you, and they sent you to all these places to learn all about wine, and I was very well schooled, and I had already got my sommelier, and, you know, I was doing really well, and I was in AA. You know, and what happened for me was, you know, and truthfully, if you really do that job, you know, anybody knows you really don't swallow. I mean, but, you know, I started swallowing, and was like, and, you know, I was just like little sip here, a little sip there, and, you know, then the friend came, had the birthday party, and I was drinking, you know, champagne at Le Dome, and then, you know, the birthday party came, and I was like getting loaded there, and then my birthday came, and my friend invited the drug dealer next door, and this night is really the night of all spiritual awakenings for me, and the reason why I tell this story is because if you know anything about me, my spiritual awakening was so shallow that it was the only thing that could get me to notice what was going on. But that night, it was my birthday. Everybody came. The drug dealer was there. They brought the cake out. I was drinking wine. The drug dealer puts, you know, cocaine up my nose, and I hadn't done cocaine for quite a little while now. And what happened for me was I stood there, and once I ingested that, my eyeballs hit the wall, slung back into my head, and I was off and running. And that night probably was one of the nights I have to say, from my own whatever, was the most demoralizing night for me, because within a couple hours I was Velcroed to the drug dealer's ankle as he was dragging me down the hallway, and I'm begging him for drugs, and he's locking the bedroom door on me. So I go sit in the living room, and I'm just like in this drug haze, and the next thing I hear is God. And everybody's like out of their minds talking about God. And the drug dealer comes in, and he stands in the middle of the room, and he says, I'm going to tell you what my gods are. So, of course, he's the drug dealer. Everybody's like, shh, you know, the room gets quiet. Now, remember, shallow spiritual awakening. He, in one hand, has a couple of grams of coke, and he has maybe a couple of $100. And he pulls his pants down, he grabs out his dick in the other hand, and this is what went through my mind. There is not enough blow in that hand to last me for 20 minutes, and there surely is not enough money for 15 minutes, and what am I going to do with that? There is nothing that's ever going to work for me in that area, and at that point I got up and I walked out the door. That was my spiritual awakening. Because, come on, face it, girls, you got to work it to keep stoned. I mean, you know, whatever. Do what you got to do. You know, I kept knee pads in my car for a long time. And, and it was great. And I had just, you know, months before that, I'd been in Europe, and I bought a Vespa, and I sent it back. And, I was always the crazy girl that you would see driving down Sunset at 3 in the morning in 6-inch heels and mini skirt with, blonde hair flowing in the wind and makeup down to her chin looking for drugs. It was not a pretty sight. So I jumped on that Vespa, and I, drove home, and I, got home, and I was out of my tree, wired out of my mind, and I got on my knees, and I said, you know what, dear God, this is not working for me. Something, you got to help me. Got to help me with something, please. Just let me go to sleep. I'll never do this again. And, I got into bed, and I passed out. I don't know why. I'd never been able to pass out in that condition before without any kind of help of a downer. I woke up the next morning, and I called my sponsor, and I told her what happened. And I said, will you still sponsor me? And she said, Linda, we are only here to help an alcoholic get sober. I'm not here to judge you. You can go in and out, in and out, in and out all you want. I'm just here to love you and help you find sobriety. And I'm very partial to slippers because I was one, and I just think, it takes an immense amount of love to keep someone here, and it's what I found for me, And she said, I want you to do 3 things. And I said, what's that? She goes, I want you to eat. I want you to eat some food today. I want you to get a lot of sleep. And I want you to meet me at the log cabin at 7:30 tomorrow morning. Can you do that? And I said, yes. She said, are you willing to turn your will and your life over to the care of God one day at a time, whatever that may be? And I said, I think so. She goes, okay, then I think we're going to get somewhere here. And next day I walked into the log cabin. Bill Valley was the speaker. Best thing that ever happened to me. He was great. I actually laughed. And that day I woke up. My friend came to pick me up, Julia came to pick me up, and there were 10 of us girls that got sober together. It was actually a group of people, and I highly recommend newcomers you get yourself a posse and stick with it, because there were 10 to 12 of us that got sober, and we had so much fun. But she picked me up, went to that meeting in my pajamas, and when I walked through those doors, I couldn't grasp the concept of God, but I could grasp the concept of turning my will and my life over to the care of AA one day at a time. And, that first year was a nightmare. It was an absolute nightmare. I hated being sober, but I did everything that was asked of me. I took a commitment at every meeting. I started working my steps. My sponsor lived a half a block from me. If God doesn't have a sense of humor, my God knows me only too well. My sponsor now. My sponsor now has been my sponsor since 7 years. I'm the kind of alcoholic that will leave town for a year, and then call her at 10 months and go, "Hi, how are you?" That's the kind of alcoholic I am. But when I first got sober, I needed someone who was right there. And this sponsor lived a half a block from me, and she became the mother that I never had. And I would, check in with her every day, do a grateful list, pray, do an inventory. I'd call her, go, I don't feel good today. She'd go, write about it, come over. And I'd come over, and she'd have tea and cookies. And she was an artist, and her whole house was painted in different Monet scenes. Like the living room was Monet water lilies. The kitchen was Monet sunflowers. The bedroom was Monet night. It was brilliant. This was just what I needed. And life went on. I got sober. I took a year. The infamous story. I was in a meeting one day. I had so much anger I could part the seas of AA. People saw me come and they would just leave. And, this guy spoke. He asked me to read a vision for you. I stood up and said, fuck you. One half of the room said, keep coming back. The other half of the room said, boo, go get loaded. 2 guys were making a bet in the back. That bitch will never stay sober. And I saw them take the bet, and I went, if you're an alcoholic like me with as much anger and belligerence as I had, I stayed sober that first year on belligerence alone. Thank God. Defects of character turned around as an asset. And, and the years flew by. I did a lot of H&I work when I first got sober. At 7 years sober, I was at a phone booth with sleeping pills and a bottle of Evian, and I had to start working the steps all over again. 10 years sober, I wanted to drink and use so bad that I ended up going to the Pacific Group, the infamous Clancy story, which I don't know if any of you heard, but I go to the Pacific Group. My sponsor, Mary Murphy, tells me to take a coffee commitment. I take a coffee commitment. They say you have to wear a dress. I say, no way, I'm going to wear a dress. She goes, you have to wear a dress. No way. Yes, you do. No, I'm not. Okay, I'll wear a dress. So I wear a dress. My first Wednesday, I'm pouring coffee. I meet these girls. We're chatting away. Clancy comes up to get a cup of coffee, and he's getting angry that we're, like, talking. He says, you girls need to shut up and just pour coffee. And I looked at him and I said, old man, fuck off and get out of my face, you degenerate piece of shit. And you know, the Pacific Group seas parted, man. It was like I had leprosy. You know, those people just was like, I mean, if they would have had poison darts, they would have all been in my back at that point. And, you know, Clancy walks away and he starts to walk towards me. And I said, don't come back, old man. Don't do it. Don't do it. And he walked away, and I went back. I sat down, went at the break, poured more coffee. Nobody would come and get coffee from me. So the next day I called my sponsor and I said, I have something to tell you. She blew a gasket, and she said, okay, you have to call Clancy and you have to apologize. You have to make amends. But where are you? I said, I'm at work. She goes, you can't leave work until you talk to that man. And if you haven't talked to him by 10 o'clock tonight, then you're sleeping at work. And I went, oh, yeah, right. And so I did. I took that direction, and I called. Finally, at 4 o'clock, I got a hold of Clancy, and he said, hi, Clancy speaking. I said, hi, Clancy, my name is Linda. You may not remember me, but I told you to fuck off last night. And he's like, oh, I remember you. I said, I need to make amends to you. I said, I wholeheartedly make amends. It was not a good thing that I did, and I feel very bad about it, and I need to make those amends. And he went, no. He says, I need to make an amends to you. He said, I read it wrong, and, you know, if I in any way infringed on making you uncomfortable, I apologized. He said, and from now on, every Wednesday night I'm going to get my first cup of coffee from you. And every Wednesday night for that year, he got his first cup of coffee from me. And every time I see him, he has a hug and a kiss for me, and he asks me how I'm doing, and he's really glad to see me. And I'll tell you, at that moment, Clancy changed my life. I stayed in the Pacific Group for a year, stayed sober. My program changed, and at a year I left and went back to my home group, West Hollywood, and I'll be forever grateful to him. And, you know, life's in session. Parents die, friends die, illness, you know, wanting to get loaded, not wanting to get loaded, you know, moments of serenity, not moments of serenity. But, you know, the whole time what saved me in AA was getting a sponsor, taking commitments, and working the steps. You know, my first 9-step amends, when I did that, I was right where he was, doing that A step. My first amends was the amends I swore I'd take to my grave. You know, because I knew that if I made that amends, all my friends would go away. And I made that amends. And, you know, my best friend and I have a better friendship than we had ever had, you know. And he, when we were going through this thing, he had stood behind me 100%. And I had lied to him. And after that, each amends was easier. They just kept coming, and it got easier and easier. And I'm going to end with this. I always like to tell a little bit of the story. I don't have time to tell you the whole story. But at 2 years sober, I went to work at a restaurant called Jimmy's as a hostess. And one night I found a 9.5-carat diamond somebody had lost off their ring. And this was at a time when, you know, in the 80s, when women were wearing junk jewelry all over their clothes, you know, those big old fake rhinestones and stuff. And I thought it was just a fake rhinestone. And I got home, and my roommate was still using. She had a friend who was a gemologist / drug dealer. And when you put a light on this diamond, the whole room lit up like aurora borealis. It was gorgeous. It was gorgeous. And 4 o'clock in the morning, we go up to the drug dealer / gemologist. We're going to give her the diamond. She's going to black market it. I'm going to get a lot of money, and I'm going to go live back in Europe and fuck this LAAA shit. And what happened for me is, I can't tell the whole story, but it didn't end up that way, as you well know, because if I ended up getting that money and going to Europe, I wouldn't be standing here before you today. I ended up returning that. It's a whole other story, and it's pretty funny, but But that really was the beginning of of how to work a program in AA. You know, at almost 2.5 years sober, is when I really learned what it was like to be truly, truly sober and do a sober thing. And what's happened for me through the years, up until today, as I work in the business that I love working in, you know, I do wardrobe, and I've worked with a lot of fabulous people, and I have a lot of fabulous friends. I love these two women. I just adore them. I have a great sponsor, and you know, I get to live out a dream. You know, I always dreamt that I wanted to live back on the East Coast and here, and I get to do that. And every 2 or 3 months I get to go back east, and I get to hang out with my best friend who's like my sister, and I am her children's godmother, and I get to have fun and do all the things that I like to do sober, you know, and none of that could have happened without Alcoholics Anonymous. And you know, there's something, I'm going to end with this because my time is way up, and I don't ever share this from the podium. This is a first for me. I've only ever shared this in women's meetings a few times. When I was 18, I got pregnant with twins, and I gave those kids up for adoption because my mother would not let me keep them. And I carried a lot of guilt over that through the years. And about 5 years ago, I went, maybe a little longer, I went on the internet to open up the files and put my name out there if they ever wanted to find me. And I haven't had any luck with that yet, and I'm a firm believer, you know, that I think if your children need to find you, they will. I don't want to go there because I don't want to have them not be confronted when they're not ready. But what's happened for me is through this program, my godkids have become sort of like my children. I've been there when they were born. I've watched them grow up. They're 8 and 5 now, and they are a big part of my life, and it's kind of a little bit of what God gave me back that I so desperately needed. And what happened for me in AA is my life came full circle, you know, and I'm grateful for that. I can't tell you that I'm some religious guru, because I'm not. You know, I'm not a big book thumper, but what I do is I help another alcoholic, and I'm of service. And that's my story. And I want to thank you for paying us 12-step call on me.
Sorry to interrupt your viewing. Taper Dave here. Just wanted to take a second to ask you to like and subscribe to my channel. Let me know if you like what you're listening. I've got some very good talks here, and this one's a great one. Just curious, do you think this is better than Zoom? Tell me what you think. Okay, this is how I prepare my drone for launching. I like to do it inside the cab of my truck so I'm not standing outside in the weather. To install the joysticks for control, up and down, right and left, powered on. I have an Android phone that I use to connect it to the drone with. And it's actually controlled through the iPhone, through an app. Oops, wrong way. It's actually controlled through the iPhone, or through this Android phone, through the app. It's actually controlled through the Android phone, through an app, and you connect it through this short connection right here.
Remote control connected.
Remote control's connected. So I pull out the drone. I have to extend the legs. Long legs extended first, then the short legs. Remove the gimbal protector. Set that aside, then power it on one short burst and one long burst. I lay it down. So I have to go to calibrate. So the drone's not connected yet. It shows you here as this drone gets disconnected, even though the remote's powered on. So the drone has to establish it's connected. So I go into the app, to calibration mode. First I'll calibrate the remote controller. Start calibration. Out, in, oop, out, in, up, down, and then this little wheel is to control the gimbal. So it's calibrated. Go to gimbal calibration, start calibration, and then it calibrates the gimbal. I don't know if that shows up. The gimbal's moving all over the place. Changes, you can see it on the video. And I'm calibrated to take off. It's acquired 7 satellites at the moment. There are 26 satellites up in the sky, which it has to acquire before you can take off. So it's connected. It's got enough satellites. This is white. I can go to press this little arrow button, swipe right to take off, and it would start the motors if I slid this to the right. But I'll wait till I get outside. Don't want to do it inside.